Welcome to the Matthew Moran podcast. Here I sit down and talk with some of the best photographers, writers, editors, designers, and publishers working in the visual arts. These conversations will give you an insight into the lives of creative professionals and industry experts, and it is a chance to hear their story and personal journey in a rapidly changing, highly competitive, but hugely exciting field. I've had the pleasure of working with many of my guests over the years and have learned so much from spending time with them. Not just working together on projects, but having conversations about what it means to be a creative freelancer, sourcing exciting projects, sharing skills through partnerships, and not losing sight of your goals and dreams. This podcast is my chance to share these stories with you. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. My guest today is Josh Kempinski. Josh is the country director for Fauna and Flora International in Vietnam. One of the world's oldest international conservation organisations, FFI currently works on over 140 projects in more than 40 countries. Based in the capital, Hanoi, Josh runs the primate programme. Remarkably, Vietnam has 25 primate species, of which 11 are critically endangered. We hear lots about the race against time to save species, and the situation in Vietnam is unprecedented. Take the cat bar langur, for example. With only 50 to 60 individuals remaining in the wild, it's a species hanging on by a thread. Vietnam's economy has been one of the best performing over the past 10 years, which is good news for a country that not so long ago was desperately poor. However, this growth has brought with it the inevitable thirst for raw materials, for new homes, hotels, and luxury resorts, which pushes wildlife populations into smaller, more isolated islands of habitat. Despite the perilous situation, Josh and his team remain positive and have seen great success stories of species rebounding back where proper protection has been put in place and doggedly managed. In this episode, Josh talks about the day-to-day life of a conservationist who started out like many, putting in numerous hours volunteering and working for low pay. During this time, he gathered a wealth of knowledge and experience that has helped him to follow his passion for more than 20 years. This interview took place in Hanoi, where I spent a few weeks putting together a film with Josh for FFI that talks about conserving Vietnam's primates, the threats they face, and the race against time to save species. Josh speaks openly about his journey to becoming the country director and how he believes there's a good reason for hope in an age where positive environmental stories are heavily outweighed by the negative. So here's my conversation about conservation with Josh Kempinski. My first international podcast. We're in the city of Hanoi, capital of Vietnam, and I'm with my good and very old friend, not old in age, but we go back a long way, and we tried to organise this podcast many times when you were back in London and failed miserably, so we've done it the hard way. But this is great. So welcome along, Josh Kempinski. Thanks for taking the time to be on the podcast.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Matt. Looking forward to it.
So obviously I'm here and to see you, and we've been doing this work together. We're making a video. Hopefully by the time this podcast goes out, actually they might go roughly around the same time, we're going to release this video that we've made that highlights the essential need for conservation, focusing on primates in Vietnam. And it's been fascinating for me. It's been a real eye-opener, and also seeing you work and kind of really seeing the front line of conservation work here, and the work that you do and the work that FFI do and the partners. And it's kind of Great. On one hand really exciting, on the other hand really daunting, and I'm sure it's like that for you every day. But also what's really good about this podcast and coming to you as a conservationist and not necessarily a photographer is that the last sort of 3 guests I've had have all been photographers, right. And they've all been kind of more focused on the conservation side of photography. So It's nice to be able to speak to a pure conservationist. And really, I think what might be quite good is, there are parallels between making your living as a photographer, the same as making your living as a conservationist. And, I get a lot of people who follow me or have been listening to this podcast who are keen in those fields, and there are crossovers, but it might be a good place to start going back to your roots in conservation and what got you interested in the natural world and why you decided to take that path at a young age.
Right, yeah. Well, it's funny, of course we grew up together in leafy North London, but it wasn't exactly a forest with not a lot of wildlife around. But yeah, from a very young age, I was really interested in conservation long before I even knew what conservation was, as a thing and as a profession. I think I used to think of it as just saving animals. I think I used to use that term quite a lot.
Right.
I think probably quite young, we were exposed to Greenpeace and the whole kind of whaling, anti-whaling, sort of the seal cubs in sort of Canada being clubbed.
Yeah.
All that stuff was from a very young age really stuck in my mind. So it was more, I think, probably even maybe more sort of started with almost animal welfare, just like wanting to save animals from bad things happening to them. And I turned vegetarian when I was 11, much to my parents' surprise, and we had loads of pets at home, cats and rabbits and rats and birds, and was really interested in wildlife and wanting to save it. But it was years later that I even found out that conservation was a thing. I think for a long time, between those very young years and then actually getting into conservation for quite a long time through school, actually, I think I thought that maybe sort of exploration was kind of the thing to do. So like I was going to become, I don't know, like a Ranulph Fiennes or something, that kind of thing, like, basically an Indiana Jones kind of sort of fantasy of being in the forest, being around wildlife, adventure, but really not knowing, and, I think even back then, so this is in the 80s, conservation wasn't nearly as well known and talked about as it is now. Nothing like it. So I think even the adults around me didn't even really know what it was to even direct me. So it wasn't really until my late teens, or even when I went to university, that I realised actually what I wanted to become, and then started down a path to get there.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, I think probably, people weren't really talking about what was endangered or critically endangered.
No.
Which I guess means that, organisations like Greenpeace and WWF and World Fauna Flora International have existed for a long time. The role that they have in kind of informing people is huge and can't be underestimated. But you mentioned like Indiana Jones. Were you also, like me, watching BBC wildlife documentaries and David Attenborough, and were there any other kind of key influences when you were younger that you can look back on now?
I think it was definitely those documentaries. My whole family were really into those documentaries, particularly my grandparents, actually.
Right.
And they became really interested in wildlife, I think, at a time before it was really sort of in vogue. And I remember they came into a little bit of money after they retired, and they spent quite a lot of that money just like on various wildlife watching trips. They went to the Galapagos, they went on safari, came back with all these cool pictures. And so I think that was an influence, actually, funny enough, more than my parents, who weren't that interested in that sense. And wildlife documentaries then sort of, even though we grew up in London, trips out to the countryside. I had a cousin that lived in Sussex, in quite a rural, not in a town, kind of quite a rural part of the county, and there was like forest at the end of her garden, and we used to like kind of, all the cousins used to go down there and play in the forest and stuff. So I think those were like quite formative. Those things really stuck in the mind. Yeah.
And so you mentioned going to university, and at this time maybe even not knowing what conservation was, but it wasn't obviously, I want to be a conservationist or I want to work in conservation. So what did you study and why?
Yeah, I did geography as my undergrad, which is interesting, because even though it wasn't, that is not, a lot of conservation sort of don't come in that route, but actually it's a really good degree for conservation, because it's very holistic, and you learn about how sort of how things interact sort of on the ground, spatially, and what leads into things looking the way they are, what are the drivers, what are the forces, And a good geography degree will bring in sort of politics and economics and environment and everything, which is actually a really good training for conservation. So I think by the time I'd chosen geography, I had a sort of rough idea that what I wanted to be. I still didn't really fully know. If I'd fully known, I probably would have done a zoology degree, to be honest. But I did a geography degree and then realised pretty soon at uni what I wanted to be, and actually thought, oh, this is probably actually quite a good degree. And then since then, in later life, you do meet quite a lot of geographers actually in conservation. So obviously it is actually probably now quite a sort of normal route.
Sure. Yeah. And I was thinking actually, because I know you did a big trip to Asia. Was this before or after university?
Before, yeah.
So before, so you would have been what, 18?
Yeah, 18, yeah.
And so that was your first kind of big trip out of the UK. And it's funny now, us both being in our 40s, and we look back on that, 18 is really young. And tell us a little bit about that and where you went, why you chose to go where you went, and how long you were away for. And
right, yeah. So even that's interesting, because even just a few years later, when you and me travelled in Africa in our early 20s, that trip was completely about wildlife and completely about national parks and protected areas and understanding those, visiting those. Whereas just a few years before that, on that Asia trip, it was just much more sort of standard gap year, and I didn't I hoped to see a lot of natural sort of wonders, whatever, but I was not, there was no plan around that.
Sure.
And I was actually right early on in the trip, we had a pretty amazing experience, which again was probably quite formative actually for me, which was that we were in India, and we were there more for kind of cultural reasons and just sort of like sort of the Rajasthan and the forts and the rivers and all that kind of stuff. And then I had a friend of mine, an Indian friend of mine, who said, "Oh, while you're here, we should go to a national park together." And I was like, "Oh yeah, okay, that sounds like a good idea." I didn't even know that was like a thing to do. And he took us off to Kanha, a national park in central India. And we did this kind of the classic kind of morning and evening game drive, and I was like completely blown away.
Right,
it was absolutely amazing, and just that was like, I think probably that was the final clincher.
That was the sort of the hook moment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
the sort of misty mornings, the bird song, getting up a bit tired, before sunrise.
Yeah, all that. Yeah, right.
It's lovely.
Yeah, I just didn't know that was. Yeah, I didn't really know that was a thing. Yeah, and then was hooked.
And so you went to India. You went to
India, Nepal, same sort of, went to a reserve up in Nepal, was really nice, and then China, and then for about 6 weeks, then into Vietnam, which of course was interesting because I ended up living here.
Amazing.
And I think that was also formative for that as well, because India and China were both amazing, but pretty kind of full-on experiences, especially for like an 18-year-old.
Yeah, and what year was this that you did?
This is 96.
So this would have been like kind of pretty much no internet, no mobile phones, not even, let alone smartphones.
Absolutely. No, pre-mobiles,
So you kind of, to communicate, you're writing letters and visiting post-restaurant.
And I promised my mum I'd go to the post office and do get a charge card or do a reverse charge call once a month from the post office, and pretty much to keep to that. But that was it. That was my only communication with my family, was a once a month phone call. Pretty different for young people backpacking today.
Amazing.
WhatsApping and whatever with their parents. And then from that into Vietnam, and Vietnam it's obviously changed a bit now. Vietnam's pretty hectic itself these days, but back then in the mid-90s, Vietnam had only just opened up to the outside world.
Wow.
A couple of years beforehand, was still a pretty poor country, but it was really calm and quiet, and people were lovely, and I fell in love with it, definitely.
People on bicycles instead of mopeds.
Oh yeah, and now everyone's in cars. It's like it's changed so much in 20 years. Amazing.
Yeah. But that trip wasn't like, oh, I've fallen in love with this country, I have to come back here, this is where I'd kind of love to work.
I definitely did fall in love with Vietnam on that trip. It really stuck in my mind. Indonesia and Vietnam were the two countries that really stuck in my mind, apart from the national parks in India, which were amazing. But as countries, those two kind of stuck out. But but it was but yeah, it's a few years later I got a possibility of work, and I was like, oh well, I already know Vietnam, I think it's a really lovely country, and now I've got this opportunity, so I came back. That was in 2004.
Yeah, and that's interesting because this idea of a possibility of work, and there's a lot of people, and I mean I would even say from my experience of talking to people, it's probably even harder to get paid work in conservation than it is in like the visual arts. There's so many areas of employment opportunity with not just being a photographer but being an editor or videographer, and you can pick up stuff, gear relatively cheaply. But conservation, I mean, not only do you have to be like hugely well qualified, you've got to put your volunteer hours in. And how did that work kind of after university, and you sort of finding work or finding your path, and knowing what you wanted to do?
I think if you ask any conservationist, I think most of us have sort of similar-ish stories actually, and it's I looked for volunteer opportunities. You write a lot of letters. Of course, most get ignored, and of course now I receive those letters often, and that's funny. But and then eventually something sticks. And actually, my girlfriend at the time, she saw an advert on a. So I'd already done 2 or 3 years of volunteer work. One of those years was in Greece, which was great. Doing some radio tracking with large carnivores, which was really cool, up on the border with Bulgaria. So I'd done some nice volunteer work, and then she saw this advert for they wanted a kind of a paid volunteer, but a couple of $100 a month of paid volunteer to come to a national park in Vietnam and help them develop a kind of field program, start helping with a bit of field work. 1 year position. I was like, yeah, brilliant. And then that was that.
And I think I've asked a lot of my guests about the sort of the nitty gritty of the finances. I've my last guest, Margot, she was a kind of a high flying PR person in PR, ran her own company, and then basically gave it up to go into conservation, and she's produced all these great books, and that's one thing. And I asked her, well, how do you actually make a living? So if you were like doing volunteer work for a couple of years in Greece and where else around Europe, how are you paying the bills?
It's funny, isn't it, when you're young, it's like you don't seem to you don't have very much, and yet you don't seem to also need very much. I mean, actually, I say a couple $100 a month. Actually, I think it was $100 a month the first year I was there, and then I got 100% pay rise, and I paid $200 a month in the subsequent year.
And you're probably like, wow, this is incredible.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're living in a national park. Accommodation is provided. You obviously while you're at work, everything's provided. If you're on a trip, of course, you get like costs covered. And they had a little restaurant in the national park where I could just get pretty funny. It's pretty much the same meal pretty much every night, which didn't cost very much.
It's not like you could go out to the local town and go to cinema.
No, there was none of that. And then people in Vietnam are very generous. People always kind of inviting you for food, inviting you for drinks and stuff, and drinking local rice wine, which is really cheap. And I actually couldn't spend that $100. and funnily enough, it was such a small project that we had to pay for our own. We had to pay for our own internet use.
Wow!
Because that was like a big expense for the project. Of
course, yeah.
So it was. I mean, your own personal internet use. So so I had to contribute sort of $10 or something, $20 for internet. And actually, I'm forgetting. It was mostly not internet. It was mostly calls.
Right.
So I was at that time still. My mum was not online, and so I was calling my mum, and actually my girlfriend at the time as well was still back in the UK. So it was calls to my mum, calls to my girlfriend, and a bit of internet time, and that was probably half of that $100, and the rest went on a bit of rice, and that was it, and I was fine. So now,
it's incredible, isn't it? What were you doing? What were you doing in the national park? This was in Cuc Phuong. Right?
This is in Cuc Phuong National Park. Yeah, so one of Vietnam's sort of oldest kind of flagship protected areas. It was great. So it was a small carnivore project that I was actually working on, sort of affiliated to the national park, but with a couple of Westerners on it and some Western funding. And they had a rescue centre there. I'm not captive. I didn't have any experience in captive works. That wasn't my background. But or they asked me to come and help with sort of developing a bit of a field research program and training rangers and doing some student training and stuff. But I'm not sure I was super qualified for it. But I knew some things. Obviously, I had a degree and actually at the beginning I was actually doing my master's research. That's actually what kind of brought me out there right at the beginning, and then I stayed on for a year and then 2 years contract. But it was nice because also once you're in the national park, you can help with other things. So I helped them develop like some ecotourism activities, night spotting, camping trips. They didn't have anything like that. Right. So they were pretty open to like experimenting with stuff, and it was all really popular. And
great.
Yeah, I think there's a leaflet in Cookville National Park, which is still the leaflet that I developed.
That's brilliant.
Yeah,
and that kind of thing must be satisfying. Is having an immediate impact, and people being open to ideas. And I don't know, I'm sure like there was a lot of bureaucracy, but if you can have direct results, then you might be making a small difference in your field.
Oh, it was amazing. Yeah, I mean, it was sort of when you're a young conservationist and it's all you want to do and you love it and it's exciting, and then someone says, and I'll pay you to do it. It almost feels weird.
Sure. I
think that's why so many conservationists get paid so badly, because at the beginning you don't really almost expect it or want it, and then you pretty much accept whatever you're offered. Is later in life that you think, actually now I've got to pay bills and mortgages and stuff. It's a bit different. But sure. When you're young, it's like as long as you're not starving, you're happy.
And did you know immediately, kind of after university, that at some point, if you wanted to go into this career, that you were going to need a master's? I mean, I know it's less important in the photographic world that you need degrees, that you need masters. I mean, but unsurprisingly, most of the top photographers are also biologists / zoologists. They really know their subject.
Of course, yeah.
But I'm guessing it's probably more important in conservation to have, that study under your belt.
Yeah, I mean, I think in theory it shouldn't be. I think, HR departments would tell you that if you can do the work, if you've got the skills, if you've got the experience, then you should be employable. But actually, a lot of people will definitely look to see. The first thing they'll check is your qualifications
and like where you got it from as well.
Yeah, exactly. Have you got the right degree, or relevant degree? Have you got a relevant master's or higher? And that is, I think, and actually, and for some employers, it's it's a prerequisite. Like you can't apply for that. There's actually not even a glass ceiling. There's just a ceiling. You just cannot apply for certain positions without a PhD. I think I might be misquoting, or maybe things have changed, but I think institutions like the World Bank, ADB, Asia Development Bank, I think you actually cannot apply for certain sort of chief technical advisor positions without a PhD. I don't know if that's still the case, but no, it's a scientific world. It's a technical field, and actually, if you don't have technical qualifications, you will struggle.
Actually, now going back, and of course knowing you so well, and this is interesting, talking in more detail about your career path, is you've had this sort of study A-levels trip abroad, to have that experience of other cultures, and a great time. And we risk sounding like a couple of old men in the making. It wasn't like that back in our day, but traveling in 96 without internet, without mobile phones, and of course we didn't know any different. Looking back now, it's amazing. I've been on this trip now and been WhatsApping home and messaging through all sorts of different platforms. I'm sort of digressing, but the point is that you then went to uni, come out of uni, and of course we did that big trip in Africa in 2000. Josh and I bought a Land Rover, and that was really when I mentioned it a few times on this podcast, but I got kind of hooked on wildlife photography, and I thought, so we made a good team, probably still influenced by Indiana Jones, but a bit of David Attenborough as well. But going to East African national parks, and I mean that whole trip was really based around national parks and how they function. And I remember actually you talking then about that kind of interest around national parks and people living on the edges and buffer zones. I remember you talking about that quite a lot. So having that sort of understanding that you can't just have a national park and there you go, that's for the animals, and outside's for the people, because of course there's always going to be conflict.
It's more complicated than that.
But then, in between all of this study, it's sort of like this really nice, well-rounded experience, and probably a good break between getting your head down in the books and reading. But so tell us about what you did for a master's, and I guess it's almost like you're honing in a little bit more.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it was. So I obviously had a geography degree and then had a bit of volunteer experience, but yeah, getting a sort of an appropriate master's was definitely. I think probably maybe even at the time didn't realise just how useful I kind of thought this is probably a good idea, but actually afterwards it was actually a really good idea. I think it definitely did help me later on in life in my career, and particularly because there is a side of conservation that's very academic. There was not some people like me are more in that sense more practical, more hands-on in some ways. But a big part of what we do is obviously peer-reviewed papers and academic research and people being affiliated with universities and all that stuff. So actually, running through conservation, there is actually a tremendous kind of respect for having the right qualifications, and so as I said, so that I think that actually did stand me in good stead, because I went to Imperial College to do a master's degree in ecological management,
right,
which is like a really good university, obviously, and like a completely appropriate degree course, and it was a great course, really just 1 year, but really, really good, really, we did learn a lot, and that definitely did help me later on in life. So because conservation in many ways is ecological management. So it's a very appropriate sort of title. So and then from then, and then it was that was 2004, and it was the research for my thesis at Imperial that took me to Vietnam.
Right.
And so I was there for a couple of months, obviously gathering data, and it was about protected areas and people and tourism and stuff, exactly what you were saying. And then from that they offered me a job, and then that was it.
Yeah, and that's so funny. We've been talking about that so much this week, about kind of people and protected areas and the conflict and the issues, and so fast forward, I don't know how many years, 15 years, you kind of been coming on and off back to between sort of London and Vietnam, and you're now the country director for Vietnam for Fauna and Flora International.
That's right. Yeah.
You're at the top table now. You're the the big cheese in conservation. I'm just kidding, but it's like I said earlier, it's been great watching you at work this week and kind of being involved as well. But yeah, looking at some of those issues and the job you're doing now, maybe just talk about that a little bit and talk about your role and what you're doing with FFI, and actually also just kind of how long have you been working with FFI now? So I know you've had quite a few different jobs. So everything has kind of gone full circle. So I joined FFI here in Vietnam in 2007. So did 2 years in the national park, a bit of consulting work, and then started working at FFI. So it's been a long time. Yeah.
I did. There was a year and I left in the middle and then came back. So it's not quite that whole period. But yeah, it's funny because when I joined FFI in 2007, I was a technical advisor, a kind of somewhat junior technical advisor for the primate program.
Right.
And now I'm the country director, and the primate program has kind of almost spun out to be the country program. So we focus sort of 80-90% of our work in Vietnam is on primates, because Vietnam is such an important country for primate conservation.
Why is that?
It's amazing actually. So anyway, Vietnam is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, which a lot of people don't know. I think top 6, top 15, top 16. Let me get the stats right. I think it's I think it's top 15, top 16, and about 10% of the world's biodiversity is represented in Vietnam. It's not a big country, so about 1%. I think about 1% of the Earth's surface. So
most people wouldn't think that.
No, you think
that Amazon.
It's totally It's actually more biodiverse in terms of its richness than and a lot of sort of probably countries more famous for their rainforests. But no, Vietnam is a pretty unique sort of special place, and it's all to do with its geography. Really, it's in the transition zone between the humid tropics and the Sundaic region of kind of basically Southeast Asia, and then moving up into the Himalayas and sort of continental Asia. So it's that transition that gives it a tremendous range of habitats, and of course, with the range of habitats and ecosystems comes the range of species. So much more biodiverse than somewhere like Cambodia, for example, which has far fewer different kinds of habitats.
It's so close, yeah.
Which is just next door, yeah. Vietnam's got and everything from sand dunes and dry forests to limestone karst forests and huge wetlands, and obviously one giant coastline all the way down. So, from that diversity of habitats comes, and particularly with some of the limestone karst forests, which are themselves very unique, you get this incredible diversity of species and across several taxa, but one of them is the primates. So in Vietnam there are 25 species of primates, which is obviously a lot and pretty surprising. Of which 11 are now critically endangered, or will be in the next IUCN updating of the red list. So 11 are critically endangered, and 5 of them are endemic.
Wow.
And so primatologists, not all of them would agree, but you hear more and more people saying that kind of Vietnam, Indonesia, and Madagascar are like the most important countries for primate conservation,
right?
Because you've got this incredible range of species, and so many of them are under threat. That's not to say that obviously places in South America aren't important for primates, but they don't have maybe that same combination of diversity, uniqueness, and threat. And certainly in Vietnam, without urgent action, we're facing, sort of a primate extinction event of potentially several species, which of course is sort of unheard of in sort of human history. So it's a bit desperate, to be honest. Yeah.
So you're really now kind of at the forefront, and I don't know, do you feel a sense of responsibility? And obviously it's not just about you. You're the program or the country director, and it's not just even about FFI, of course. Sure. But I can imagine it must be. It's a bit of a race against time.
Yeah. We've sort of started saying to people that this is the moment. This is it, really. I think that's probably true of a lot of places in the world where it's sort of, this is literally do or die. And I don't know whether it's a 5-year window or a 15-year window or whatever, but I think we need to make changes now that give us the opportunity in the future to still have some things to conserve.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember you and me talking about this years ago, but there are some great examples of conservation over the last sort of century and more where animals got down to very, very few, and then conservation action, took place.
Yeah.
And then just by, obviously by just not being extinct, of course, you then the potential is to rebound. And rhino and water buffalo up in Kaziranga in India is a good example.
I was thinking actually when you mentioned that about sea otters in the Pacific Northwest or around Vancouver Island are virtually extinct.
Yeah. And obviously the classic is there are many, but buffalo in North America,
of course, yeah.
down to whatever it was. I think double figures, 30 or 40. I can't remember exact figures, but right on the edge of extinction, from hundreds of thousands down to whatever it was. And then
of course there's wolves in Yellowstone. It's an incredible success story.
Bringing those back. So I think and so I mean most of the time it's a job, and you've got a job to do, and you don't necessarily stand back and think about the importance of it. But sometimes it does hit me, particularly if I'm talking to someone else about our work, and I'm explaining that for several of the species that we work on, we are either the only or the main NGO supporting the government. In some cases more than others, the government's not that engaged.
Right.
So it's sort of almost only us. And you think, wow, how did we get to this situation?
Sure.
where I mean, for example, one of our species that we work on north of Vietnam is the Calvit gibbon, which is actually the most threatened ape in the world.
Right.
And yeah, we're pretty much the only NGO working on its conservation. They're down to about 135 individuals, although that's pretty much doubled since FFI started working. So
Wow.
that's
Good news. It sounds dire, but it's pretty desperate, isn't it?
Dire, but at least the trend's the right way.
Yeah.
They live in about 1,000 hectares of forest.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it really is, bad, a bad situation. Although, as I say, bad but improving. But still, if chimpanzees or orangutans were at that level of endangerment, it would be front page news and everything else. But for whatever reason, certain taxa become sort of famous and others don't, and that's also, and it can be an issue in conservation.
Yeah. But
an ape on the edge of extinction.
Yeah. Actually, we'll come back to this because I wanted to ask you a question about that. Is getting your message out there, and that there's this idea that Vietnam's this biodiversity hotspot. Not a lot of people know that. Not a lot of people know that there are 25 different species. Not a lot of people know that 5 of them are endemic. You just mentioned the Calvert gibbons. How much of your work, other than just the frontline conservation work that you're doing, the day-to-day stuff, is trying to communicate this to people and trying to get action and trying to get funding and trying to get protection and awareness and all of those is another kind of side to the job. How do you reach your audience?
You touched on it there a lot. It's conservation is it goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's multifaceted, it's holistic. You do need to be doing all of those things, and at the same time not spreading yourself so thin that it becomes sort of meaningless. So definitely we definitely focus on on the ground in situ conservation. So finding populations that we think are viable and then doing what we can to bring about their recovery, to change the state, the status of that animal, of that population. So we focus on setting up protected areas, supporting protected area managers, improving protection, improving crime prevention. It does all of that stuff on the ground, and so I suppose you could say that awareness raising, is a lesser part of our, not lesser. It's less of my work is about awareness raising, partly because it's so immediate what we need to do. We just don't have the sort of the time, the luxury for a slow societal change,
right?
In that sense. But at the same time, probably that's the only thing that's actually going to save these species.
Right.
When Vietnam is sort of quote unquote, when Vietnam is in a position to and has the interest and has the money to want to do it themselves, then that's when you'll see real change. I think international NGOs, often the role that we perform, as I sort of touched on earlier, but is to just kind of, it's basically to avoid extinction. Really, is to make sure there is enough representative habitat and species left that you can kind of pass the baton on to Vietnam, and then because you need millions and millions of pounds and dollars and policy and attitude change, and to really conserve, particularly, some of the animals need large habitats, some of the large charismatic kind of megafauna, the elephants and the wolves of this world, tigers, actually NGOs can't do it themselves on their own. It has to be a hugely collaborative effort, and it really ends up being a government activity. So, but actually NGOs can actually sort of stop the rot, and we've proven that already a few times in Vietnam, that with a relatively small amount of money, some hundreds of thousands, maybe a few million over a few years, actually we have been able to turn it around for some of these species. But and going from maybe 50, 60 individuals up to 135 is a huge achievement. But taking it to the next, taking it to the next level and setting up several new reserves and translocations, and I think you probably have to look to, you have to look to countries where you have conservation on that scale, and it's a government it's supported by civil society, of course, but it's a state activity. Places like America, which have fantastic protected area systems, countries like Costa Rica, where they've kind of built their whole economy around conservation and ecotourism, and even read some really interesting examples in China, which of course can be a sort of pariah in some areas. But yeah, I mean, think of the resources they put into the recovery of pandas. They put in. I've heard it's now in the billions of dollars.
Unbelievable.
Over whatever 20, 30 years, and of course the result is that they've generated many hundreds of pandas to the point where they're no longer critically endangered.
It's incredible.
It's incredible.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the success of the cow bit, and it might be good now. We often talk about the doom and gloom of conservation, and I mean, it's good that it's in the press, so much with biodiversity on such a downward spiral, because you do hope, even though sometimes I feel like people get just desensitized to it, but you do hope that it does have an impact. But we touched on this in the making of our video in this last couple of weeks, the hope and the positive stories, and I don't know, maybe it might be worth mentioning the stuff that we did in Kimbang around the Delacour's langur, and this is another species that you're kind of better placed to talk about, and maybe we talk about a little bit about the history of them, and them being critically endangered, endemic, and Van Long, and the new site.
Yeah. I think global trends can be, or they are depressing, and I think it's a bit of a cliche now, but thinking globally and acting locally, which is, I think, what I was taught at university, was the way to achieve sustainability. But actually, it's very wise words, and I think that's definitely how how we operate here in Vietnam, which is, do what you can in prioritize in terms of species and sites, and then do what you can to protect those. And if you can achieve measurable success, at that level, then actually you are making a change. And I suppose the only way we'll turn the tide on the global biodiversity crisis is just lots of more local successes. I mean, it is important to have global agreements on biodiversity, like the Millennium Development Goals and so forth, but you can see that it doesn't necessarily have the impact, because translating that a global agreement on biodiversity into hundreds of thousands of decisions on the ground is very, very difficult. I mean, it's a very important framework to have, but as you mentioned, Kimbang, one of our sites here, and Delacour's langur, critically endangered and endemic, only found in a few provinces in Vietnam, down to about 250 individuals, and wherever it exists, still threatened. So for all the agreements and all the conferences and everything else, that species will be saved by establishing, as what we're doing now, establishing another protected area for it, getting in place good protection, getting in place good management, reaching out to local people, showing the local people that it can have we think it can have a huge value as a kind of mascot for local tourism. Tourism's huge in that area. Instantly, they filmed the latest King Kong film in the reserve where the Delacour's langur is found.
Yeah.
So there's
hopefully some positive publicity there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sort of hooks to kind of hang this on and get people interested. But I think we will succeed there. I think we will set up the new national park there. I think that population will be protected. I think tourism will grow, and of course there'll be challenges there, but potentially also, we can harness that. And I'm optimistic about that site and about that species, even though it sounds on paper to be dire. And we talk about our worries about the elephant, the re-emergence of the ivory trade and so forth, but there are still hundreds of thousands of elephants compared to some of the primates we're working with in Vietnam, down to the last, in some cases actually double figures, which is obviously very worrying. But site by site, case by case, we do have successes, and I think we have to hold on to those and build on those. And then, obviously all around the world there are lots of conservationists and lots of like-minded people and lots of really good and genuine people in government who do want to achieve something. And I think, I think there's nothing else we can do. If we give up on that, then of course we've given up. So
so it's a bit like if you stand back and look at the whole picture and look at it globally, then almost no point in getting out of bed. But
exactly.
What gets you out of bed is we created a reserve to protect 40 langurs.
Yeah.
And that number could hopefully increase with that protection and investment in patrol teams. Sure. And maybe people doing some science on the ground, some ecotourism, and getting local people on board.
It's potentially even more tangible and even more rewarding actually than some of the other major environmental issues of our time, like plastics and climate change and everything else, because although it's very important that we all live as sustainably as we can, we also know that our individual action is very won't make a huge difference. It's en masse collective action, whereas if you yourself stop using single-use plastic, of course that won't make a difference. Of course, if 1 million people do, of course it does make a difference. But in the conservation context, actually, a very small group of people with limited resources can actually stop the extinction of a species. And there are some examples in conservation around the world over the years of individuals doing it. Some amazing stories of bird conservation where one person has gone and collected the eggs and incubated them and raised chicks and put them back in the wild, and you've gone from I can't remember. There's one very famous species. I think it's in Mauritius, or where they were down to maybe 10 or less of one bird species, and now it's recovering. And I think it was pretty much down to one person.
Yeah, so, it's incredible, isn't it?
And so conservation can be in that sense incredibly rewarding, and
it's kind of unconventional as well. One person going out, and actually, as you were saying that, it reminded me of there's a great photographer and conservationist called Robin Moore. He's a Scottish guy, lives in America, and I saw him speak this year, and they were trying to do this work around this frog that they believed that there was only one left. And they actually set up on a dating site, Match.com, a profile for this frog, like looking for a mate. Right. And it went absolutely viral. Right. And then through that campaign, they raised, I don't know, I'm guessing, Google it if, for the listeners that are interested, it's a really amazing story. Yeah, right. But, they raised a load of money and it funded, scientists and experts going out in the field, and they found this frog a mate. And, and I think, it was a success story. And
no bread or whatever.
Yeah. I know, it's amazing. Yeah. It really is. I thought of one thing actually that I was really interested in that you mentioned earlier about passing on, the baton to Vietnam and getting government interested and getting local people interested, because there is, you've mentioned it in the film that we've made, there is, this kind of youth movement here in Vietnam with the wealth that's been generated in this country over the last 30 years. There's this big middle class, movement. There's young people that are passionate about their country, passionate about their environment. So can you talk a bit about that and kind of what's happening? And I guess the ultimate goal is that, you're not needed here because, in Vietnam, it sounds patronizing, but of course, they can take care of themselves, but, the expertise from the West. But talk a bit about the sort of the youth movement here in Vietnam and what's happening with that.
Yeah, I think that I think it dawned on me quite a long time ago, but definitely feel quite strongly about that it's part of a development curve that we all go through. I don't think it relates particularly to any great cultural norms, or I think look back in our own culture in the UK, and there was a time when there was no concept of conservation or animal welfare, and those things evolved when people had the time and the luxury to think about those things, and it wasn't just putting food on the table and priorities and pragmatism, and I think that's where Vietnam is now. As I mentioned, back here when I was here in the 1990s, I didn't really realize it at the time actually, but Vietnam was really poor in the early 90s, and was still suffering from the war, and then obviously what came after the war, and they were very isolated, and etc., and sanctions and so forth, and they still had there were still food shortages. They were still importing, living on aid from Russia and stuff, and I've heard some amazing stories in the early 90s of people here like receiving grains from Russia which they didn't know how to eat.
Wow.
They didn't know what it was. They just kind of boiled it with water and ate it, and it's like gross. They had no idea how to to turn it into bread or anything. And literally, it's kind of remarkable stuff to think how where Vietnam is now, one of the best performing economies in the world, GDP growth, and Vietnam has made incredible strides out of poverty. Some of the best sort of figures in the world in terms of the numbers of people who have come out of poverty. Mm-hmm. So I think like I said before, conservation here in Vietnam will be successful when it's completely normal. Mm-hmm. It's just part of being a Vietnamese person, Vietnamese government, like how normal it is. I think in that sense, America is a good example of that. Yeah. Everyone has heard of the national parks, and a lot of people go to the national parks. In fact, the biggest problem they have in the States, or one of the problems they have, is people loving their national parks to death. Yeah, and millions of people going to them, and obviously the government wanting them to be open and accessible, but then actually needing to control numbers and so forth. I think that's where Vietnam will be in the future.
You're hopeful for that?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at other countries in the region that are a bit more developed, or went through economic development earlier for various reasons, like China, like Thailand, you see that already. You see some. China funds its own reserves extremely well. There are potentially some issues about China's global footprint on wildlife, but actually domestically, they actually do a pretty amazing job of protecting biodiversity more and more. And a lot of state funding, and hundreds of millions going into their protected area system. So I'm very hopeful in that sense. So to sort of go back to your point, I think. Yeah, we are sort of making ourselves redundant in many ways and handing the baton over. And there's already huge signs of change and development with, as you say, young people, the government, companies. That isn't to say there isn't still a long way to go. It's still early days. It's definitely still early days. But the point is the change is in the right direction. Yeah. Even when I got here in 2004. There was no kind of youth green movement to speak of, and now there's lots of, everything from Facebook groups to small NGOs to kind of civil society organisations to, sort of already a few kind of heroes coming forward, and people being kind of, young people who are now famous in the in that world, a small world, but like. Yeah, that gives me a lot of optimism.
Yeah, even in my short time here, just a few weeks, I've met many young people who have, or even your colleague Lam, studying his masters in Hawaii. I met Chung, a young guy who works for Green Viet, a NGO in Da Nang and south of here. He's studied his PhD hoping to study his PhD in New Zealand. So, it's just to think about the effort of doing that in a foreign language, and it's incredible. Really impressive.
Yeah, we see that more and more as well. People coming through here, working with NGOs, building up the experience, building up their language skills, then going off and getting qualifications abroad, then coming back and being even more qualified, even more useful, and taking it forward. I have at FFI here, there are 22 of us in terms of the staff, not including the community patrol teams. That takes us over 100. But in terms of actual staff, people on staff contracts, there's 22 of us, and I'm the only foreigner.
Right.
And that's not out of any kind of like over, nationalising policy or, positive discrimination or anything. It's just that, we're in Vietnam and we need to do conservation, and so we hire people to do it. And of course, they're all Vietnamese. They're totally qualified.
Whereas it could look like, the Westerners are just hanging on by a thread.
And I suppose in that sense we are. And I suppose there's still a role for international people, or there are roles for international people if they have particular skills or specialisms to offer. But we're right on the edge of that being sort of regardless of where you're from. So it could be a Vietnamese expert might be also international because he or she might be working in Laos or Cambodia as an expert.
Sure.
And I think so in that sense it becomes a kind of level. You'll still have international people sharing ideas and being experts and things, but it's no longer really about like it's already been handed over in that sense. It's already FFI Vietnam is aside from me, and obviously I have a sort of a particular role also kind of interfacing a little bit between FFI and the UK and Vietnam. So there are particular things that relate to me being international and also language and English as a first language and stuff. But yeah, for 99% of our work is the staff who are all Vietnamese, working along with local communities who are all Vietnamese, protected area managers who are all Vietnamese, and government departments and Vietnamese donors. We have increasing money from Vietnam, which is great. Yeah, it's a very Vietnamese picture. Yeah, and that's great.
Yeah, that's great. Really good. The time always flies when I do these, but we'll slowly come to an end. I'll sort of a couple more questions, sort of really regarding like the future. So in a two-pronged question is one is like kind of you as the boss of the Vietnam program here in FFI and FFI's hopes. Say for example, like in 10 years, what you hope to achieve. And then kind of you personally, we talked a lot about your journey getting here, and obviously this is, you can go further, you can become FFI CEO or whatever, but like, what your hopes are as well.
Interesting. Yeah. Good question. I mean, I think it sounds a bit kind of easy to say a bit, but I think FFI's plan is to stay here as long as we're needed, I think that it will be quite clear when we're not needed, I think probably it would become suddenly very difficult to raise funding and it just wouldn't make sense anymore. I think when there's no need, it will be clear. I don't think that's imminent, to be honest. I think the role of international NGOs is still, it does fill a gap, and there's a level of expertise and an approach, and of course, being FFI Vietnam, we're FFI, we're not FFI Vietnam. It's just a country office, sure. And of course, behind me is this wealth of experience and expertise, which I can and do draw on at all times. So, and local NGOs don't necessarily have that, and a lot of our work is actually about partnerships and working. So even as well as all my staff being Vietnamese, we also work with several Vietnamese NGOs. So, it's not just. It's not. I think it's a bit easy to say capacity building. I think capacity is in many ways already very high, but there are just certain facets of our work that just benefit from that international support, international framework, and it relates to funding and academic links and all kinds of nuances. But
and I guess these things, like you said, it's not FFI leaving here, kind of brushing your hands like our work is done. It's not going to happen overnight. We phase very gradually.
Exactly. But yeah, exactly. Phase. I suppose you go through a process of nationalising, which we already have. I mean, when FFI started in Vietnam, which is 21 years ago, it was about 50-50 foreigners and Vietnamese. Right. There were lots of young expat, people like me, although I wasn't there at the beginning, but people like me. Whereas now, of course, it's very different. We don't need that or look for that anymore. Of course, it's different country by country in the region, but I know it's the same and even more in China. There's most NGOs are 100% Chinese for the same reasons. And you're right. It's not about just saying job done and we're off. It's a slow process of transition and an FFI continuing to support, and maybe that the type of support will also change over time. And you go from being, it's already changed in the last 20 years, from being very Western driven and hands on to being more of a facilitating role, and then maybe even more in the background, maybe just working maybe we would eventually close the country office, just work through partnerships, and I suppose eventually you wouldn't need to exist. But I think people do sometimes say that about conservation NGOs. We know we've succeeded when we won't need to exist anymore. But I have to say, I think that's a utopian vision.
There's always going to be a need, isn't there? Because
Exactly.
they're always going to, there'll be a new mining company that wants to set up, and there'll be like a new logging company that wants to go in, and
I think that about like, for example, the UK where we're from, or the US, where there are lots of lots of conservation NGOs that even focus within and really long-standing and excellent organisations like Audubon Society,
Sure.
or Nature Conservancy, huge NGOs in America who have clearly a lot of work to do in just maintaining that amazing protected area system, and all it's constantly under threat. And now see the Trump administration's in, and overt attacks on the system and on its funding, and physically, and also in terms of finances and everything else. And then, like in the UK, I'm a member of Woodland Trust, and there's a constant battleground for what's left of our ancient woodlands.
Of course.
Planning decisions, and there's a new railway up to HS2, and is it going to go through SSIs, and so I think the idea that so I think civil society NGOs will have a role to play, probably forever, or whatever that means. But whether that's a FFI in its current form or another form, or it's yet to be seen. But no, I think you need both. You need the state and civil society kind of working together in whatever context. So and me personally, just to the second part of your question, me personally. I don't really know. I think in that sense, I'm not that ambitious. It's always been. I've always, again, it goes back to really loving my work and really loving being a conservationist, loving wildlife, and actually just always been pretty happy with where I am. And then, after some years in a position, you start to get itchy feet, and you start looking for you realize, okay, maybe I've done what I can in this role, and maybe I'd like to apply this to something else. That happened in my last role. I was international RED Plus specialist. RED Plus is basically climate change and kind of forest conservation and the nexus between those two, and I did that for 5 years and loved it. For FFI international role, working in different countries, brilliant, and I sort of fancied a change, and that coincided with this job being available in a country where I'd lived before and loved it, and etc. etc. So it was like perfect timing. I suppose something like that will happen again. Whether that's 2, 5, or 10 years down the line, but there'll be a time when I'm looking for something else.
You might be the driving force behind it, or it might be an opportunity that comes up and presents itself. And go, actually, maybe I fancy a change.
I think it depends on. As I say, because I'm not that ambitious. I'm not someone that's like looks at job websites or speculatively applies for things. I'm just not like that. So, I'm pretty focused on what I'm doing, and I'm enjoying it, and I'm pretty 100% in it, and I'll be like that until such a time as something changes, and that little voice inside you says, "Oh, maybe we should."
And of course, the other things outside of work are, your wife is here, she's Vietnamese, you've got a son, and there's other things that come into play, like, putting down roots. And
sure.
Even though I know there's always been sort of this battle with being torn between loving London and the work's here, and
I think that never goes away. If you are someone that, like us, if you're from a big city and you love home, you're always going to be torn. There's parts of me would love to live in London, part of me would love to live in New York. I like cities. I like I love the energy and the kind of vibrancy of just people, and I'm a city person, but I love being in nature. I love being in the forest. I love my work. So I don't think I'll ever fully reconcile that kind of contradiction.
But that is the perfect segue into my final question. I ask all my guests this, but I'm going to link it into you talking about loving nature, loving wildlife, being in the field. And obviously we've done a lot of travelling together in Africa, North America, India. And that really is where like the buzz is, it's where the passion is. And so really, well, the question is, what advice would you give to a young conservationist, someone who is looking at job sites and it's all volunteer roles, no pay, but loves being in the field? And then there's this kind of switches. You talked about doing great field work and cooked film, but then the realities are, I think, like with most jobs, the same with all photographers. You end up spending time in an office in front of a computer, writing proposals, just sort of the boring stuff. I'm kind of, this is a question, but I'm just sort of musing all over this. But I think it is interesting that the reality of it is not quite as sexy and romantic,
Sure.
as the sort of the young Indiana Jones, going out in the field. So how do you encourage, or what would you say to a young person who wants to get into conservation and not make it, but it sounds cheesy, but you know what I mean, just try and make a living out of it, basically?
Well, I think the good thing about conservation is that it requires a lot of different skills and specialisms, and I think that's one of the lessons learned of the last few years, whatever a few years is. But it isn't just a job for zoologists. I think that's a really important part of understanding what conservation is. Conservation biology is a really important part of what we do, and it's only one facet.
Right.
And actually, so much of what we do is a real kind of hybrid of politics and sociology and environment and understanding land use and planning and policy and drivers and what the drivers behind drivers, and then understanding, well, we can't change that, but can we interrupt the system somewhere to make a change, and theory of change. And I think don't be put off. Don't worry about it in that sense. If you're really passionate about conservation, if you really love it, and you're willing to put in the hours and work, I think you'll find your place. There are some people who started off like we all do, in the forest, kind of doing surveys, and 30, 40 years later, they're in the forest doing surveys. That's what they love. And then, of course, those people become often really focused specialists on one tax or one species, and they're potentially the global expert on that. And that, and if that's what you're into, then great. And then everything else, monitoring and evaluation and management and HR, and so it requires all of that. So whatever is your skills, you can put those to good use for conservation. But yeah, be willing to put in those early years of hard work when realistically the pay isn't great, and realistically the pay is never great. So be ready for that. But yeah, it's rewarding, and yeah, once you get to a certain level, of course, I'm country director now. It's a profession, and we live comfortably here, and life's pretty good.
Yeah, great. That's an awesome answer. Do you feel like we were out in the field the other day watching red-shanked dougalangers, and it was like we were 21 again watching lions in East Africa. But do you get out as well, being country director? Do you get out in the field as enough? Because it's important, right? You can't always be in front of a computer.
It's a good point. I think you have to find your own balance. I think some people forget that it's important, and we are always quote unquote too busy. I mean, I'm too busy every day, so it's very important that you just say, well, I am too busy. I don't have time to go to the field, but I'm still going, because otherwise you would lose touch. And of course, every time I go to the field, I take copious notes, I learn loads of things, get totally inspired, realise that maybe potentially how something's been reported to me is not exactly right, or something got lost in translation. So every time I go to the field, it's extremely useful and refreshing and everything else. So probably not enough, but I do get to go quite often. I think the big change is very short trips.
Yeah, sure.
It's a half a day, 2 days. Yeah. And I've got to get back to the office, and certainly gone on the days of spending weeks and weeks in the forest. But no, I get out there a fair bit. But obviously I've got a family now, and I've got a young son. He's 2, and you also don't want to be away from home. That's the change that I think you don't necessarily expect. It's not just that like these things are all a burden. You actually, as much as I love being in the field and love being in the forest, I want to get back to the office. I've got important things to do, and I really want to get back and be with my family.
Of course, yeah. It's funny, you get to that age now, you need your creature comforts as well. Like, think about what you did or how we lived in Africa on whatever it was, $10 a day, and not washing our pillowcases for 6 months, and you can put up with that, can't you? But
when you're young.
Josh, brilliant. Thanks so much. We did it. We finally did it, and we made the time, and it's been great. I've loved being around you and FFI, and your staff have been great, and
good. Thanks.
All the experiences that this trip's afforded me has been brilliant and totally inspiring. And so with all of these podcasts, I'll put up some links, and so we can put links to FFI's website to find out more. Also Green Viet, you mentioned partners. They were brilliant. Really, really good support on all the work they're doing with the Duke Langers and more. And anything else that you tell me, we'll put up in the notes.
Cool.
And
great.
Hopefully, this we'll reach a wider audience and get more people inspired about primates and primate conservation in Vietnam. So, thanks so much.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Matt. It's been great.
Many thanks to Josh. What a great talker, and inspiring to hear his story. And in the heart of the very country where so many of these amazing species live was such a treat. I was lucky that during my visit I had the chance to see firsthand so much of the development taking place and some of the huge mines that are devastating the primate habitat. It really is quite mind-blowing. So if you're interested, in a couple of weeks I will have this film fully edited and up, and keep an eye on the video page on my website, and you'll be able to see it, and hopefully we'll enjoy that and share it. The situation really is on a knife edge there, and if you also want to get involved firsthand, you can help by becoming a member and supporting FFI's work simply by visiting their website. There's information there. It's fauna-flora.org. And if you want to find out more about some of the endangered and critically endangered species Josh is working with, you can visit fauna-flora.org/countries/Vietnam. I'll put a full set of links up in the notes on his page. One thing that's interesting is hope has been the key theme in the last few podcasts, from Margot's grassroots conservation and the fight to save African species to organisations like FFI working with government and civil society. And the recent environment protests by Extinction Rebellion have got people talking, and more importantly, taking action. I can be down as anyone when it comes to the plight of species, but being part of this movement, which can and will affect change, is so inspiring, and I'm remaining positive, going along on the ride, and I encourage everyone who listens to this to do the same. Get involved, no matter at what level, whether it's a campaign to clean up the streets in your neighbourhood, planting trees, joining in protest about environmental issues, or going deep to study and learn about conservation like Josh did. There are endless ways to get involved. So if you've enjoyed this podcast and others, I would love it if you could spread the word. They are all completely free, so you can pay me back with 5 minutes of your time to leave a review on iTunes, let others know what you think, and sharing it on your social media networks. And just by telling your friends about it would be a really big help. It helps us to reach a wider audience, and also for people who are not necessarily familiar to the nature photography world but do have an interest in it, and they can hear and all these great stories and all the hard work that so many dedicated people that I've interviewed put in, and what goes on behind the scenes. So again, to find out more about me, you can visit my website. It's matthewmoran.com. There's tons of information up there. I've got a blog, obviously this podcast page. You can watch videos, scroll through my galleries. I'm going to put a new one up, a Vietnam one up pretty soon, to tie into the release of this podcast. And social media, Twitter and Instagram are both at Matt Moran Photo. Facebook is Facebook.com/Matthew Moran Photography. If you'd like to meet me, come on a workshop, improve your photography skills. If you're in the London area and want to come on beautiful Hampstead Heath, you can visit the workshops page on my website, check availability there. May is sold out. Taking bookings for June. I've only got a few spaces left. And then we have a summer break and back again in the autumn for the beautiful colours. The next 2 podcasts I already have booked in. I've got 2 heavyweight photographers and filmmakers. Really excited about that, so stay tuned. And until then, thanks again for listening, and see you next time.